For most of human history, wars were understood as temporary ruptures in normal life, violent interruptions that consumed vast resources and then eventually ended, allowing societies to rebuild. Yet, beneath the familiar stories of battles and treaties, there emerged a quieter transformation, one that changed the nature of conflict itself. Because over time, wars stopped being merely political or territorial struggles and gradually became something else, something more enduring and more profitable, as financial systems evolved that could absorb destruction, convert it into predictable returns, and sustain conflict not as an emergency, but as a permanent economic activity. And this shift did not happen through a single invention or conspiracy, but through centuries of incremental changes in how states borrowed, taxed, insured risk, and delegated violence, beginning in early modern Europe, where monarchs faced the recurring problem that no amount of battlefield bravery could solve, namely the staggering cost of maintaining armies and fleets for longer than a single campaigning season, a problem that forced rulers to look beyond treasure chests and plunder and toward more systematic ways of financing war. Particularly as gunpowder weapons, professional standing armies, and ocean-going navies dramatically increased expenses, making war less about feudal obligations and more about sustained cash flow. And it was here that the foundations of war as a business quietly took shape, because once rulers learned that wars could be financed through credit rather than immediate wealth, conflict became less constrained by existing resources and more dependent on confidence, trust, and the expectation of future repayment, which transformed war from a gamble into an investment. And in places like Renaissance Italy, the Dutch Republic, and later England, governments began issuing long-term bonds to fund military campaigns, selling claims on future tax revenues to merchants, bankers, and wealthy citizens who were not fighting the wars themselves, but who now had a direct financial interest in their continuation and outcome. And this alignment of public violence with private capital created a feedback loop that reshaped incentives on all sides, because lenders wanted stability and repayment, rulers wanted continuous access to credit, and armies required uninterrupted funding, leading to the emergence of permanent fiscal institutions designed not to end wars quickly, but to manage them sustainably. And this fiscal military state, as historians later described it, was not inherently sinister, yet its logic carried profound consequences, because when wars could be financed indefinitely through borrowing, the pressure to seek rapid resolution diminished, and conflicts could stretch on for decades as long as the interest payments were met and the financial machinery remained intact, which is precisely what happened during the long wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, such as the 30 Years' War and the series of Anglo-French conflicts that spanned generations, where battles ended but financing continued, and the system matured further when financial innovations reduced risk for investors, turning war lending into a relatively safe and even attractive asset class, particularly after states developed reliable taxation systems capable of servicing debt regardless of battlefield outcomes, meaning that even losing a war no longer implied the fault, only higher taxes, which shifted the burden of conflict away from elites and financiers and onto the broader population, making war politically survivable for ruling classes while remaining economically profitable for creditors. And as central banks emerged, most notably the Bank of England in 1694, the relationship between war and finance became institutionalized at the highest level, because central banks were created not primarily to stabilize economies in the modern sense, but to help governments borrow cheaply and efficiently during wartime, pooling private capital to fund public violence, while offering investors liquidity and security. And this arrangement proved remarkably resilient, surviving regime changes, revolutions, and defeats, because it embedded war financing into the core architecture of the state, turning conflict into a routine fiscal operation rather than an existential crisis. And as this model spread globally through empire and imitation, it laid the groundwork for the modern military industrial economy, where war preparation itself became a continuous economic activity even during periods of peace, since maintaining creditworthiness required maintaining military capacity, and maintaining military capacity required ongoing expenditure, research, procurement, and employment, which in turn created constituencies whose livelihoods depended on the persistence of military spending, subtly shifting the meaning of peace from the absence of war to merely the absence of active combat, while the financial machinery continued to run uninterrupted beneath the surface. And this transformation accelerated dramatically in the 20th century, when industrialized warfare demanded not only soldiers, but factories, supply chains, energy systems, and scientific research on an unprecedented scale, drawing entire economies into the logic of permanent mobilization. And during the First World War, governments learned that they could fund total war by combining mass taxation, mass borrowing, and monetary expansion, effectively spreading the cost of conflict across generations. And although the war ended, the financial structures it created did not, because war debts became long-term political and economic realities, shaping policy for decades and embedding the assumption that future conflicts would also be financed through similar means. And this assumption became self-fulfilling during the Second World War, when war spending reached levels previously unimaginable, and entire industries were reorganized around military production, creating a deep integration between state power and corporate capacity that did not dissolve when the fighting stopped, but instead reoriented itself toward new threats, new weapons, and new justifications, especially during the Cold War, when the concept of permanent readiness replaced the traditional cycle of war and peace, and defense spending became a constant feature of national budgets, justified by abstract, enduring dangers rather than specific, time-bound conflicts. And from a financial perspective, this was the moment when war truly became a permanent business, because military expenditure was no longer episodic but structural, supporting stable revenue streams for contractors, predictable budgets for governments, and long-term investment horizons for capital markets, all reinforced by political narratives that frame security as an ongoing condition rather than a temporary objective. And at the psychological level, this system reshaped how societies perceived conflict, because when war is financed through distant mechanisms like bonds, deficits, and inflation, rather than immediate sacrifice, its human costs become abstracted, allowing populations to tolerate prolonged military engagement without the sense of emergency that once forced rapid resolution, while at the same time the diffusion of costs reduces resistance, since no single group feels the full weight of the burden. And this diffusion is not accidental, but central to the system's stability, because a war that is financially unbearable quickly becomes politically unacceptable, whereas a war that is economically managed can persist with relatively low public friction, especially when framed as necessary, defensive, or unavoidable. And within this environment, decision-makers face incentives that subtly favor continuation over closure, because ending a war does not automatically dismantle the financial structures built to sustain it, and in many cases, doing so would disrupt industries, employment, and fiscal expectations, creating economic uncertainty that can appear riskier than maintaining the status quo. And this does not require malicious intent or coordinated planning, only institutional inertia and rational behavior within existing systems, where each actor responds to incentives that make sense locally but collectively produce a global condition of permanent militarization. And the consequences of this system extend far beyond national borders. Because once war financing becomes standardized and scalable, it enables conflicts to be exported, prolonged, and fragmented across regions, often through proxy wars, arms sales, and security assistance programs that transfer military capacity while keeping the core financial beneficiaries insulated from direct harm, effectively externalizing violence while internalizing profits. And this dynamic has shaped much of the post-war world, where conflicts rarely end decisively but instead fade into frozen states
stalemates or low-intensity struggles that sustain arms demand without triggering the political costs of full-scale war. And over time, this has normalized a global economy in which preparation for conflict is one of the most stable sources of government expenditure, even as other forms of public investment fluctuate, reinforcing the idea that security spending is non-negotiable, while social spending remains contingent. And as financial markets have grown more sophisticated, the integration has deepened further, with defense companies listed on stock exchanges, military budgets influencing market expectations, and geopolitical tensions becoming variables in investment strategies, subtly aligning financial interests with the persistence of insecurity.
Not because markets desire war in a moral sense, but because uncertainty and defense spending are now embedded features of the economic landscape. And from a psychological perspective, this arrangement alters how power is exercised, because leaders operating within such systems may come to see conflict less as a tragic failure of diplomacy and more as a manageable tool of policy, constrained not by immediate cost, but by long-term fiscal capacity, which can create a dangerous sense of control, where escalation appears financially tolerable even when human consequences are severe. And yet the system also contains its own vulnerabilities, because financing war through debt assumes continued economic growth, political stability, and public compliance. And when these conditions falter, the accumulated costs can surface abruptly, as seen in moments of fiscal crisis where military commitments collide with social demands, forcing painful choices and revealing the true price of prolonged conflict. And historically, such moments have often preceded major political realignments, revolutions, or retrenchments, reminding us that while war can be made into a business, it cannot be made entirely risk-free. And as the 21st century unfolds, the legacy of this financial system remains deeply embedded in global institutions, shaping responses to crises, conflicts, and perceived threats, often privileging continuity over transformation. Because dismantling a system that turns war into a permanent business would require not only political will, but a fundamental rethinking of how states finance security, how societies distribute risk, and how economies measure value. And this is perhaps the most enduring consequence of the system's rise, that it has made war appear ordinary, administratively manageable, and economically integrated, even as its human costs remain extraordinary, reminding us that behind the calm language of budgets, bonds, and strategic planning lies a centuries-old transformation that quietly redefined conflict itself, turning what was once an exception into a permanent feature of modern economic life, and leaving future generations to decide whether this system is an unavoidable reality or a historical choice that can, in time, be unmade.